The wisdom of the river. How to stop forcing your relationships. There is a sudden, heavy clenching deep behind your breastbone. The very instant a close friend goes quiet, a message leaves you waiting without an answer, or a partner subtly withdraws their hand from yours. Right now, even as you lie entirely still in the dark, your chest might feel like a tightly knotted rope, bracing itself against a terrifying distance that you cannot seem to bridge. For a very long time, you have been holding your breath to keep the people around you from drifting away, treating every natural shift in their affection as a personal emergency you must immediately repair. Now, the absolute quiet of the bedroom exposes an immense fatigue from trying to anchor a river that was always meant to flow. The air around you holds the raw scent of wet river rushes, drying willow bark, and cold river silt from the wide estuary outside. Your physical body rests against the coarse, cool weave of a heavy hemp mat, a completely plain surface that requires no performance or holding from your tired limbs. Your grip, which has been clenched around the hearts of others all day, can finally begin to open its fingers, trusting the dark floorboards below to support your mass without requiring you to secure anyone else's presence. You are not an inadequate shelter because human hearts naturally fluctuate in their warmth. Nor have you committed a fault because your inner core refuses to unclamp itself easily tonight. The persistent tension you carry is simply the old momentum of a spirit that has spent too long trying to act as a dam for a dynamic stream, monitoring every ripple to ensure you are not abandoned in the shallows. Tonight, there is no necessity to force your muscles to relax through an aggressive act of will, or to conquer your fear of loss with sudden, forced detachments. We are not here to demand an immediate state of perfect emotional security. Instead, we are giving the wide, open bank of your awareness permission to remain exactly as it is, letting the heavy water of the day's anxieties pass over the silt without requiring you to trap a single drop. The mind does not find its ultimate refuge because you finally managed to lock down the fluid affections of the people around you. Real liberation arrives only when you realize that the shifting currents of human closeness possess no permanent shape, much like the water that rises and falls along the reed beds as the tide moves through the bay. We frequently spend our best years treating our attention as a trap, believing we must close our walls around every passing wave of love to prove we are safe. Yet, the ancient insights remind us that trying to grip a moving current is the precise thing that causes the inner fiber to fray and burn out. The primary suffering does not live in the reality that human connections naturally shift their distance. It grows from the continuous involuntary reflex to pull tightly against the stream, turning their temporary quietness into a total verdict against your right to exist. Maybe you have felt this specific exhaustion too, the deep loneliness of believing that you are only safe when you are perfectly controlling the emotional temperature of the relationship. When you carry the role of the constant anchor, it becomes terrifying to release the muscles around your ribs, fearing that if you drop your vigilance for even a single second, the bond will wash away into the dark. You begin to live as if your peace is entirely dependent on another person's constant validation. But right now, in this dim sanctuary, you do not have to hold the riverbank together with your thoughts. As you lie here, notice the way your chest expands naturally with each quiet intake of air, and how the breath returns to the room without any conscious effort from your side. The weathered driftwood at the water's edge does not dig frantic holes to keep the tide from receding. The wood simply stays heavy and still while the current washes over its surface and moves back out to the sea. In a little while, we will visit a quiet shipyard near a tidal estuary where an old boat builder and a heavy copper weight reveal the wisdom of remaining structurally sound regardless of the flow. But for now, let the evening settle into your bones. You do not have to secure the permanent loyalty of your relationships before the morning comes. It is completely permitted, just for this hour, to let the woven fish trap rest, to let the dynamic current wash over your texture without your grip, and to allow the internal sentinel to stand down without any conditions. Consider how much vital energy is consumed by the continuous expectation of a separation. You find yourself analyzing the brief tone of an ordinary greeting, or checking the space between your body and theirs to see if you have inadvertently caused a rift in the connection. This constant holding keeps your spirit locked in a tight, protective posture, as if you are permanently standing in a rushing channel, trying to hold back the volume of the sea with your bare hands. Right now, if it feels right, you can allow that defensive grip to come to a complete halt. The space around you is not an unstable platform. The rising water does not carry a threat to your fundamental value. When we allow the frame to drop its alertness, the physical body receives the message that the immediate crisis has passed. You might notice the exact areas where your muscles have been bracing against an imaginary abandonment. The center of the chest, the muscles of the stomach, and the palms of the hands often become the storage houses for this unearned vigilance. Perhaps you can invite those specific places to soften, letting the dense fibers loosen their hold on the structure beneath. There is no need to achieve a state of perfect detachment by the end of this breath. Even noticing the presence of the gripping instinct without trying to tear it away is a quiet form of self-compassiveness. Tonight, we are not trying to repair the self through a new layer of psychological work or emotional control. We are simply acknowledging that your original ground was already complete before the world brought its changing currents into your space. The dynamic affections that have kept you hypervigilant do not form the permanent substance of your being. They are just the temporary waves passing over the silt, waves that carry no power to erode your true nature unless you attempt to lock them down with your own anxiety. In a moment, this path will lead us deeper into the silent bays of the estuary to see how the landscape handles its own movement. But for now, let the air move smoothly through your framework, resting safely in the reality of this immediate second. A quiet memory floats down a winding gray channel where the cold current smells permanently of wet rushes and drying willow bark. In this low estuary lived a young shipyard worker named Jiro, who spent his seasons smoothing cedar planks and twisting thick cords for an elderly boat builder named Master Wren. Jiro carried a heavy internal restriction within the center of his chest, a constant panic that surfaced whenever the tidal currents shifted their rhythm against the wooden docks. He lived with a relentless secret fear that the water would carry away the foundations of his workspace, or that the old builder would suddenly look at his labor and decide he was no longer necessary to the yard. Whenever the river rose with a sudden fullness, or whenever Master Wren sat in total silence for several hours without offering a single word of approval, Jiro felt a familiar cold band drop around his ribs. He would spend his afternoons checking the thick hemp mooring lines over and over, tightening the knots until his palms were raw, trying desperately to clamp down the movement of the dock so nothing could ever drift away from his reach. His attention was never on the natural beauty of the timber. It was trapped entirely in a frantic observation of the tide, searching for the micro-fluctuations that preceded a loss. During the turning of the seasons, the sky over the estuary grew increasingly dark and thick with low, purple clouds that threatened to bring a major surge from the outer bay. Jiro felt a deep, exhausting dread settle into his shoulders as he stood on the wet wooden platform, checking the storage lockers for the fourth consecutive time without letting his eyes leave the waterline. His heart thumped with a fast internal vibration, and his vision grew narrow as he attempted to predict whether the incoming current would tear the vessels from their pilings. He was terrified that if he misread a single ripple, or if he left a single line with even an inch of slack, the entire yard would wash out into the dark sea, leaving him completely abandoned in the cold mud. He was entirely bound by the belief that he had to physically hold the river steady to deserve his place by the dry hearth. A few paces away, near a massive pile of unrefined cedar logs, Master Wren sat on a low bench of split timber. The old boat builder did not speak, nor did he offer any direct criticism to the young man who was trembling in the damp wind. Instead, he pulled toward himself a heavy copper fishing weight that possessed an oxidized dark green surface, anchoring a long, coarse hemp line that dropped straight down into the swirling current below. The weight carried the solid, texturized mass of decades of immersion in the brackish water, its shape completely basic and unadorned. Wren reached out his calloused fingers and lowered the heavy copper object directly into the center of a fast-moving channel that was rushing fiercely between two main pilings. The water caused the thick hemp cord to pull violently to the side, vibrating frantically as the current surged toward the bay. The surface of the river split into white foam around the line, creating wild, erratic ripples that swept past the edge of the dock. Jiro watched the chaotic rush of the water, his stomach tightening as if the rapid movement of the stream were an indication of his own immediate failure. Master Rin did not look up at the foam, nor did he attempt to build a wooden wall to block the flow. He simply took a piece of weathered driftwood that lay on the silt bank and handed it to the apprentice, pointing toward the deep, swirling channel beneath the platform. He instructed Jiro to hold the driftwood in the water and try to keep the liquid from passing the grain of the wood. Jiro knelt on the wet planks, his fingers white with effort, trying to press the flat timber against the rushing stream. But the river changed its force every second, surging, lifting, and sliding past the wood faster than his hands could resist. He felt a deep frustration rise in his throat, a sense of absolute powerlessness because he could not trap the current or make the water stay still against the cedar. Master Ren reached out his hand and gently lifted the driftwood away from the apprentice's strained fingers. He did not tell him to grip tighter, nor did he reprimand his clumsy stance. Instead, he tapped his fingernail against the heavy copper fishing weight that sat anchored on the bottom of the riverbed, producing a low, dull thud that echoed through the damp workspace. He noted that while the water whirled in the channel and the hemp cord vibrated frantically in the surge, the heavy copper mass did not lose its location by a single fraction of an inch. The old man suggested that the apprentice had spent all his vital energy trying to dam a dynamic river with a flat board, forgetting that the heavy wood beneath the platform remained completely solid, stable, and unaffected by the volume of the stream. The bank does not alter its baseline position because a current rushes fast toward the sea. The realization entered Jiro's awareness like a heavy stone dropping into a deep pool of still silt. He looked down at his raw palms, then at the absolute stability of the heavy copper weight resting deep in the current. He recognized that the intense exhaustion he carried in his chest was not caused by the movement of the tide, nor was it coming from the nature of the shipyard labor. It was coming entirely from his own automatic habit of treating every shift in the river's volume as a personal emergency he was required to catch and fix. He had been treating his own mind like a fragile screen, letting the changing currents of the estuary dictate his safety until he had no original stillness left. In that quiet hour, the sound of the water against the pilings became slower, carrying a deep, grounding cadence into the small shipyard. The tight contraction around Jiro's lower ribs began to loosen its grip, not because the river had suddenly stopped its rapid flow, but because he had met a perspective that did not require him to clamp down the tide. The low, unchanging presence of the copper weight became an anchor for his awareness, slowing down the rapid scanning of his senses. He saw that his basic well-being did not live in his capacity to freeze the stream, but in the willingness to remain as steady as the dark silt beneath his boots. Yet, as the twilight began to deepen over the wide bay, and the darkness grew thicker in the corners of the timber shed, the complete transformation of his old habits had not yet fully cleared his path. Jiro sat quietly on the low step, realizing that while he understood the wisdom of the unmoving weight, his body still remembered the instinct to tighten at the sound of a rising wave. The internal sentinel that had watched over his survival for so many years could not be dismantled by a single evening's insight, and the long, dark waterline still stretched out across the mud banks, waiting for the morning tide to test his grip once again. This estuary workshop does not ask you to drop a massive iron gate across the mouth of your feelings, transforming your heart into a dried riverbed that experiences absolutely nothing for the world. The old boat builder was not instructing the young worker to abandon his natural care, or to view the shifting closeness of his companions with total, frozen indifference. Instead, this quiet perspective redirects our internal vision toward a much gentler realization beneath the frantic urge to lock down every moving wave of affection. It reveals that the deep exhaustion we feel does not come from the simple reality that human feelings move and change. The true heaviness accumulates when our thoughts stubbornly refuse to leave the passing water alone. attempting to press a fragile piece of timber against a massive current to force it to remain completely still. We spend our late nights weaving an intricate defense out of dynamics that were only meant to wash over our skin like a gentle morning tide. When we look closely at the landscape of our own minds in the quiet darkness of the room, we often discover that we are performing the exact same exhausting ritual as the shipyard worker. We witness a slight change in a partner's glance, feel a sudden drop in a friend's communication, or worry that our presence has caused an invisible rift in the relationship. These fluctuations are simply the natural, unpreventable movement of human lives interacting with one another, much like the changing water line along the riverbank. But our immediate instinct is to take those external movements and wrap our inner muscles tightly around them. We behave as if every single shift in closeness is a direct result of our own failure to perform perfectly. Buddhist insights describe a profound misunderstanding in the way we handle our emotional world. This wisdom reminds us that our primary distress does not grow from the fact that human connections contain temporary distance or changing rhythms. The suffering swells because the mind insists on applying a heavy layer of permanent control to an impermanent stream. A single quiet day lands in our relationship, which is like a natural drop in the water level around the pilings. Then, instead of letting the riverbed remain still, we spend hours striking the silt with our thoughts, digging up our history, and churning the heavy mud with our own self-blame until the entire basin becomes thick and cloudy. The initial change was small, passing away into the past like a current moving toward the outer bay. But our defense mechanism layers an extra turbulence on top of the original movement, turning a natural transition into a deep, painful restriction. Consider how this protective habit operates within your own frame when you are trying to cross the threshold into sleep. You might remember an instance from your day where you felt you had to squeeze your presence to keep someone else perfectly comfortable. The moment has already ended, disappearing into the past like a drop of water evaporating from a cedar plank. Yet your attention remains locked around that specific point in time, checking and rechecking your memory to ensure you did not leave a gap behind. This tight internal check is what the old teachings describe as the true root of our ongoing agitation. It is the persistent, mistaken belief that we must act as a universal anchor, absorbing every ounce of relational movement so that no one ever has to experience their own distance around us. True presence in this gentle context is simply the capacity to observe the changing currents of the world without immediately offering up your own wood to block them. It is the willingness to look at another person's shifting mood and say, "This is just their own internal stream moving through the channel tonight." When we witness ourselves with this quality of soft awareness, the desperate need to constantly fix the bond begins to lose its heavy hold. We realize that we do not need to construct a flawless, watertight box of absolute compliance to be allowed to take up space on this earth. By understanding change through our emotions, see people's temporary states, their silences, and their internal dynamics are constantly altering their shape. Nothing in the human landscape remains perfectly fixed, and your capacity to hold the presence of others will naturally change from one sunset to the next. The driftwood survives the deep water precisely because it does not try to own the entire river, showing us that true resilience lives in what we allow to wash past us. When we stop demanding that our minds trap every wave that blows across the bank, we discover a profound sense of emotional space. This shift allows real compassion to emerge, not as an exhausting duty that drains your vital energy, but as a calm, unburdened warmth. Compassion is the quiet courage to let someone else experience the natural movement of their own journey, without assuming you are the failure who caused their distance. It is the understanding that your life is not an unearned loan to be repaid through absolute compliance, but a solid plot of earth that has every right to breathe in harmony with the sea. Slowly, this way of seeing can begin to alter the landscape of your internal thoughts. You begin to notice that the spaces where you feel the most exposed are not broken pieces, but the exact places where the frame can finally drop its vigilance. In a little while, this realization will move closer to your physical body, shifting from an abstract thought into a direct experience of release within your muscles. But before we move into that quiet internal exploration, let the mind absorb this simple truth. The shipyard did not find its stillness because the worker stopped the tide from moving. It found its peace when he looked at the heavy copper weight, allowing the river to flow smoothly while the foundation beneath remained completely untouched by the current. Allow your primary attention to wander completely away from the intellectual definition of words, sliding naturally down into the heavy physical structure your body takes up right now. If it feels right, let your internal observation gather around the quiet movement of your breath at the very base of your rib cage. There is no immediate need to alter, balance, or artificially lengthen the intake or the release in this moment. Perhaps you can simply look at the natural, automatic flow of air as it moves past the throat. You might sense the cool dampness of the room entering your lungs and the matching, quiet heat that leaves your body as you relax. Your physical framework understands precisely how to interact with the night without your active direction. You can lean completely into this internal cadence, allowing the coarse hemp surface below to support your full mass without presenting a single reason for your weight. As you remain still in the darkness, let the fine muscles around your chest become loose and heavy. You might choose to invite your jaw to unlock its grip, letting the teeth separate slightly and allowing the tongue to rest away from the palate. There is a frequent habit of storing immense physical strain right in the center of the breath when we spend our lives trying to hold back the dynamic currents of the world to protect our attachments. Perhaps you can allow the front of your ribs and the tops of your shoulders to drop down just a tiny fraction of an inch further into the dark support of the bed. Even a microscopic release in your alignment is entirely sufficient for this hour. You are not trying to manufacture a profound state of spiritual clarity. You are simply letting the solid wood beneath you assume your full presence without trying to brace yourself against the night. In this space of unhurried observation, a specific mental wave may drift into the center of your awareness. It might be a residual echo of a brief conversation where you felt someone pulling back, or a sudden, sharp worry about someone else's quiet mood that awaits your energy tomorrow. Instead of pulling on this line or trying to weave it into a larger personal history, see if you can simply note its presence. You might say silently to yourself, there is the old pattern of trying to dam the stream. Identifying this internal movement is a significant step toward finding your own space. You do not need to fight the habit or try to aggressively clear it from your consciousness tonight. Even noticing its texture without adding a layer of self-reproach is a quiet form of self-forgiveness. If you choose, you can imagine that specific burden as a single piece of driftwood, resting quietly on the surface of a fast-moving channel. Picture this dark timber standing quietly in the background of your awareness, held by your own fingers against the cold water. You do not have to force the current to stay still or turn the interaction into an elaborate problem that you must solve before dawn. The heavy copper weight rests solidly beneath the floorboards, completely stable and unmoving on the deep riverbed. As you watch, see if you can notice how much empty space surrounds that single piece of wood. You do not need to add more knots, and you do not need to use the old measuring stick to judge its resistance. There is no requirement to build a dense harvest of compliance in this quiet mental room. Slowly, watch as a gentle surge of tidal water passes completely across the dark timber, lifting the driftwood from your loose fingers. Without any effort from your side, the stream carries the weathered wood completely down the channel, letting it drift away into the wide, misty estuary outside. You can simply watch this departure happen, without trying to reach out your hands to catch the fleeing shape. The original riverbed remains completely whole, letting the element move across its surface without retaining any attachment to the non-native shadow. With each breath that leaves your body, you might imagine the invisible wires of unearned responsibility loosening just a bit more within your chest. Gradually, let the image of the dark silt settle into a deep, heavy stillness in your mind. See the empty space within the channel becoming an invitation for the cool night air to circulate, clearing out the old, dusty remnants of the day's expectations. The very emptiness that felt like an exposed vulnerability is now the precise quality that keeps the ground light, resilient, and calm. What felt like an unprotected bank is actually providing a quiet space for the original texture of your being to exist without permission. You can return your attention to the simple rising sensation in your abdomen whenever you are ready. There is no deadline to meet in this practice, and no requirement to feel completely unburdened before your eyes close for the night. If your thoughts wander back to the habit of gripping others, you can gently anchor yourself in the coarse, unadorned texture of the mat against your fingers. You are allowed to be an imperfect human being, resting in a tired body, navigating a complex web of relationships. In a little while, our journey will take us deeper into the wild estuary to see how a woven fish trap functions precisely because it lets the river pass completely through its slats. But for now, let the air move smoothly through your framework, resting safely in the reality of this immediate second. The path of your attention now drifts outward from the wooden shipyard, moving quietly along the curving shoreline toward an isolated stilt hut situated directly where the fresh river mouth meets the expansive, shifting salt water of the outer bay. In this exposed, watery space lived a traveler named Kenji, who spent his years gathering wild rushes to weave simple mats for the local fishing communities. Kenji carried a heavy internal restriction within the very center of his chest, an emotional fatigue born from a long history of trying to force his closest companion to remain permanently close to his side. For many seasons, his mind had been trapped in a continuous loop of worry, anticipating every small sign of distance, checking the tone of every ordinary greeting, and keeping his entire nervous system braced against the constant threat of being left behind. He lived under the compelling illusion that if he could just construct a tight enough boundary around their bond, he could freeze the relationship in a state of absolute, unchanging security. This relentless effort left his ribs feeling permanently tight, as if he were continuously holding his breath against the natural movement of the tide. During a season of severe autumn storms, Kenji sought out a quiet river watcher named Master Daichi, who lived in the lonely stilt hut suspended over the churning estuary channels. Daichi was a person whose skin carried the deep, texturized gray of driftwood exposed to decades of salt spray, and he spent his days observing the vast, complicated meeting of the fresh water and the sea. He did not offer immediate, simple answers to the anxious traveler who had arrived at his platform with white knuckles and an absolute desperation in his voice. Instead, he sat quietly on the weathered floorboards, working with a series of long, split willow branches to assemble a traditional fish trap designed to operate in the fast-moving currents of the bay. The damp air around the stilt house carried the thick, brackish scent of wet rushes, cold river silt, and drying willow bark deep into the lungs. The emotional challenge intensified as the afternoon tide began to rise with an unprecedented fullness, pushing massive volumes of seawater directly into the narrow river mouth. Kenji felt a familiar, cold band of panic tighten around his lower stomach as he watched the current ripple fiercely beneath the platform, lifting the loose pieces of his split rushes and threatening to wash them out into the vast, gray expanse of the bay. His immediate automatic instinct was to drop to his knees, to plunge his arms into the water, and to try to physically trap the reeds against the wooden piling so he would not lose his materials. He was caught in a frantic spiral of internal thoughts that told him his entire survival depended on his capacity to hold the element still, to block the current, and to prevent the natural landscape from changing its shape. Master Daichi did not move to assist him in trapping the drifting reeds, nor did he offer a word of comfort regarding the rising waterline. He simply picked up the woven willow fish trap he had been building, an object constructed with wide, open slats that allowed the brackish water to flow completely through its frame without resistance. He reached down and lowered the willow structure directly into the swiftest part of the current, anchoring the top to a heavy wooden post with a length of coarse hemp rope. Kenji watched with a deep sense of confusion as the massive volume of the river passed entirely through the open spaces of the trap, leaving the delicate willow twigs perfectly integral, while the foam surged past them toward the open sea. The device functioned effectively, not because it dammed the river, but because it possessed the spaciousness to let the current go. The old river watcher looked at the young man's wet, muddy hands, then pointed toward the wide slats where the water moved without restriction. He noted that when a basket attempts to hold the entire river within its walls, the pressure will inevitably tear the reeds apart, leaving the weaver with nothing but broken pieces in the mud. He suggested that the trap remains whole, precisely because it does not treat the movement of the water as a personal attack against its structure. The willow allows the current to touch its interior and depart according to its own nature, remaining perfectly grounded in the silt while the stream alters its depth from morning to night. The simple observation acted like a cool drop of rain falling into the center of a tense, overheated palm. Kenji looked at the open framework of the willow trap, then at the vast unmanaged meeting of the fresh and salt waters beneath the stilts. For the very first time in his life, instead of rushing to close his hands around the passing elements, he simply stopped his defensive movements. He took a long, slow breath of the brackish air, letting the tight muscles of his chest expand completely without any artificial holding. He did not instantly experience a state of total emotional security, and the underlying fear of being abandoned did not magically vanish from his awareness. But in that quiet second, he chose to sit directly with the cold uncertainty of the dynamic current, stopping his lifelong habit of treating every anxious thought as an absolute truth about his own value. He stood quietly on the wet platform, letting the loose rushes drift away into the channel without reaching out to catch them. He did not pretend that the distance in his primary relationship did not cause a genuine ache in his heart, nor did he try to manufacture a false sense of unbothered detachment. Instead, he simply allowed the reality of his companion's shifting affection to exist without trying to construct a new cage around it, recognizing that their heart was a dynamic stream that had every right to move according to its own rhythm. He chose the small, quiet discipline of remaining anchored on the bank, letting the water pass through the open slats of his awareness without turning the movement into a definitive failure of his own shelter. He had not become a magically perfect master, but he had fundamentally altered his connection to his own suffering, discovering that the capacity to stand whole lives in the willingness to let the river flow. This internal release on the wet stilt platform opens up a deeper understanding of the exact mental process that prolongs our relational anxiety when we are left alone with the silence of the night. When your body is completely still under the covers, the active mind frequently continues its exhausting, invisible labor of auditing your primary connections. You review the small details of yesterday's conversations, searching for the precise moment where a different choice might have guaranteed absolute, unchanging closeness. You project your thoughts into the coming months, creating complex internal scripts to avoid any possible instance of distance or quiet disapproval from those you hold dear. This continuous mental scaffolding is an automatic defense mechanism born from a deep fear of isolation, a pattern that attempts to mend our natural feelings of vulnerability through a layer of quiet self-reproach. We act as if our primary security is a transaction that can only be purchased by keeping our inner core in a state of perpetual tightness. The mind operates under a powerful illusion, convincing us that we can secure our emotional well-being by continuously manipulating the dynamic currents of our environment. We take another person's natural need for space and turn it into a definitive verdict against our own value, transforming a simple, fluid transition into a permanent statement of our personal failure. This habit of emotional gripping creates an immense amount of physical restriction within the framework of the chest, locking the breath and freezing the muscles around the ribs. We become exactly like a weaver who tries to plunge his bare arms into a rushing estuary to trap every loose rush against the pilings, forgetting that the woven willow structure remains entirely whole, precisely because it lets the entire river move completely through its slats without resistance. Ancient Buddhist insights offer a helpful distinction that can bring immediate relief to your tired senses tonight. In this human life, you will inevitably encounter natural changes in closeness, moments of emotional distance, and the absolute reality that you cannot force another person's affection to remain perfectly static. These variations are simply the raw weather of interacting with other dynamic lives, much like the rising tides that blend fresh and salt waters at the mouth of the bay. This initial experience of change is a basic condition of existence that no one can entirely eliminate. However, the profound suffering we carry is not caused by these natural fluctuations. The true distress is the extra weight our thoughts layer on top of the movement when we refuse to let the current pass without our intervention. Imagine a large, coarse hemp net stretched quietly between two wooden posts at the edge of a moving tidal channel. When the river rises, a few smooth river pebbles and bits of wild reed naturally drift into the cords, resting lightly against the mesh. This interaction is just the basic, unpreventable contact between the current and the boundary. But our mind acts like a frantic watcher who begins to pull aggressively on the ropes, twisting the net into tight, hard knots in a desperate attempt to squeeze the water out of the mesh and force the stream to stand perfectly still. The frantic pulling does not stop the river from moving, nor does it remove the dampness of the channel. It only strains the fibers of the net, leaving the lines stretched, frayed, and dangerously close to snapping under a tension they were never designed to hold. The immense restriction is not the fault of the river. It is the direct result of our insistence on tightening the weave. True peace does not arrive because you have successfully forced the water to stop moving through the mesh, or because you have managed to make every single human being in your life completely fixed in their closeness. Relief becomes real when you stop twisting the ropes, letting the river pass through the cords without assuming you are responsible for holding back the volume of the sea. The tide still moves through the channel, and the waves still ripple past the posts, but the crushing weight of unearned accountability disappears instantly from your chest. When you stop demanding that your mind act as a dam for the environment, the changing moods of the world stop being an indictment against your soul. This is the quiet realization that allows you to dismantle the impossible accounts you have been keeping for so long. The old teachings remind us that there is no solid, permanent self that you must continuously defend by capturing the fluid affections of others. You do not need to spend your evenings acting as a severe surveyor, checking the thickness of your boundaries for signs of vulnerability. Your connections are not rigid, watertight boxes that must trap every drop of closeness to remain authentic. They are simply the open channels that allow you to participate in the world, without letting your original ground be choked out by panic. Letting the natural distance of others exist without turning it into a definitive failure of your own shelter. By shifting how you relate to the movement of relationships, you stop treating your daily connections as a continuous evaluation of your right to belong. When a wave of worry arises, or when the memory of a silent room surfaces, you can note the pattern without letting it dictate your worth. You can perceive the presence of their dynamic distance, without assuming that you are the criminal who must be punished for its existence. The current is simply their own internal stream moving through the channel, leaving your solid ground completely whole beneath the wide night sky. Slowly, this insight allows your physical frame to experience a genuine sense of somatic expansion. You begin to see that you can be deeply kind and fully present with the people you love, without requiring yourself to be an absolute shield that traps every drop of their emotion. The need for constant reassurance begins to lose its sharp concentration in the darkness, replaced by a steady, quiet acceptance of your own spacious nature. In a little while, our path will take us down into the specific challenges of your contemporary routine to see how this perspective can alter your daily life. But for now, let your awareness rest in the vast space that opens up when you stop trying to hold back the tide. This quiet perspective from the damp stilt platform and the woven willow fish trap belongs directly in the center of your modern daily experience, showing up in the specific moments where you struggle to find peace at the end of a demanding day. Consider the sudden, tight contraction that happens behind your ribs when you check your phone for reassurance, staring at an unanswered message as if the delay were a personal indictment of your worth. Think about the silent heaviness of maintaining a pleasant expression during a difficult conversation, while your internal landscape feels completely choked with exhaustion. We spend so much of our waking life acting as our own severe surveyor, tracking the moods of others and treating their passing frustrations as if they were direct proof of our own failure. You might find yourself lying still tonight, mentally replaying a minor error from the afternoon, reviewing your words to see where you could have been more compliant. This persistent habit of comparison acts like a sharp wind, blowing non-native currents of inadequacy into your awareness until you feel completely behind in your life journey. We try to control the emotional states of those we love, believing that if they experience a single moment of dissatisfaction, it means we are not enough. When our body naturally asks for a period of stillness, we immediately apply a layer of internal guilt, telling ourselves that we must continuously produce results to earn the right to exist. We treat our energy like a crowded ledger that must always show a profit for others, rather than a wide channel that requires seasons of complete rest to remain vital. Bringing this understanding into your immediate life does not mean you must execute a grand emotional clearance or achieve an instant state of total balance. It shows up in very small, quiet choices during the ordinary moments of your routine. When an anxious thought tells you that you must apologize for taking up space, you can choose to introduce a small gap. You can choose to take a slow breath before you jump to fix someone else's bad mood, letting their internal weather land elsewhere like rain falling on a distant stone. This quiet pause is a profound act of self-care. It is the moment you decide that your original ground is no longer obligated to nourish every stray weed of expectation that blows across your path. You can learn to care deeply for the people in your life without planting their negative dynamics directly into your own skin. When you allow your relationships to have an open, flexible framework, you stop treating every human friction as a personal debt you are required to pay. You can look at a cold reaction, an unanswered email, or a moment of social awkwardness and simply view them as wild grass growing outside your gatehouse. They do not mean your life is a structural failure. They are just the natural variations of an active world. You do not need to turn those external events into a permanent identity to prove that you are worthy of love. Furthermore, you are entirely permitted to let your physical form sink down into absolute stillness without needing to present a certificate of efficiency to the night. True rest is not a transaction you make. After all your work is perfectly aligned. It is the natural, necessary background that keeps your ground resilient over the long years. Much like the wild hemlock forest, your worth does not disappear when you are completely untended, nor does it multiply when you are crowded with non-native sprouts. The ground is complete simply because it exists beneath the sky, breathing quietly in the darkness, whether it is actively yielding a harvest or resting under the heavy winter fog. When you encounter the heavy thought that your presence is an inconvenience to the world, you can choose to treat that voice as a passing current of air rather than an ultimate truth. You can look at the thin spaces in your personal energy without assuming your character is permanently broken. By allowing these vulnerabilities to exist, you give yourself permission to be an authentic human being. You stop wasting your vital strength on the endless maintenance of a flawless facade. In a few moments, this slow realization will begin to guide your awareness into the deepest layers of sleep, where all analytical planning can finally dissolve into the quiet night. But for now, let these everyday demands lose their sharp boundaries, recognizing that your life is already spacious enough to hold it all. The active momentum of the long day has completely dissolved now. The constant, busy efforts of the analytical mind are fading out, leaving only the quiet, unobstructed space of the night. Your breath is becoming noticeably slower, a calm, rhythmic wave that requires no guidance or supervision from your side. Your physical form feels incredibly heavy, sinking deeply into the steady, unyielding support of the bed below. There is a profound comfort in letting the muscles entirely relax, letting go of the systemic grip that held you upright through the light hours. You are returning to a state of simple, uncomplicated existence. The room is perfectly dark, filled with the cool, clean scent of wet river rushes and the soft sound of night air passing through the estuary. Every single obligation for tomorrow can remain completely untouched in the dark. You are granted full permission to abandon the endless task of configuring your life. The world will continue to turn without your constant vigilance. Your awareness is settling down now, much like the heavy, mineralized logs resting deep within the riverbed silt. completely insulated from the surface currents. The frantic need to analyze your history or plan your responses is melting away into the shadows. You can let the analytical thoughts go, watching them drift past like faint mist moving over the high timber threshold. The center of your chest feels spacious, soft, and entirely open to the elements. The deep understanding of the driftwood in the silt is sinking directly into your physical framework. You do not need to measure a single current tonight. You do not need to prove that you can catch every drifting demand without shaking your own foundation. Your human limitations are not failures, but the exact places where the spirit breathes, the exact gaps where your life connects with the cool, circulating night. Let the weight of your head drop down fully into the fabric, trusting the still to hold you without any effort on your part. You are safe enough to completely untie the tight knots of your resolve. The dark river outside is patient, welcoming the currents that pass through your tired spirit, turning your secret vulnerabilities into a quiet space of restoration while you rest. There is absolutely nothing left to manage before morning arrives. The active mind is closing its heavy doors, allowing the simple warmth of the body to guide you into a state of dreamless, restorative sleep. The night is vast, dark, and completely unhurried, offering a deep home for a heart that has monitored the shifts of the estuary for far too long. What if the stillness you have been trying to manufacture by balancing the weight of the water has always been the baseline texture of the deep stone beneath the stream? The uncarved willow at the river's edge does not hold a memory of the high tides that swept through its leaves during the intense hours of the afternoon. Nor does the cool silt bank retain the shape of the frantic steps that paced across it. As the deep darkness settles completely over the wide estuary, the automatic habit of scanning the landscape for shifts in the atmosphere begins to lose its vital energy. This persistent alertness is merely an outdated tool left over from the bright, chaotic hours of the day, a protective pattern that has absolutely no function here in the silent expanse of the night. The internal monitor can simply observe its own residual echoes without choosing to obey their warnings, letting the lingering anxieties drift past like faint mist moving through the high open rafters, losing their definition against the vast indigo sky. You are under no obligation to keep a perfect vigil over the room tonight. When we look closely into the mechanism of our deepest emotional weariness, we find that the framework of the body is rarely exhausted by the simple act of living. The profound depletion grows from the continuous internal maintenance of a flawless guard, the endless effort required to intercept every flying arrow of irritation before it touches the ground of your life. But the weathered driftwood does not ask for a clear horizon to hold the shore steady. It survives the winter gale precisely because it remains deeply embedded in the cool, dark silt, allowing the wild currents of the river to grow full and low across its wood without moving the structure by a single hair. Your life is not a fragile piece of glass meant to shatter under the impact of another person's volatile mood. It is a solid foundation that discovers its truest resilience by letting the moving lines alter their geometry without your intervention. Let the slow, natural rise of your lower abdomen become the central anchor for your drifting awareness, a gentle, unhurried expansion that requires zero conscious design to remain perfectly whole. You do not need to stitch together a new layer of protection or resolve the structural friction of your relationships to deserve this state of absolute rest. The ground of your body holds its value simply by breathing, by existing as a quiet basin where the night air can circulate without being measured or controlled. The darkness is a vast, uncritical sanctuary that welcomes every exposed vulnerability and every natural limitation, recognizing them not as defects of your character, but as the exact places where the spirit can finally drop its vigilance and rest safely in the dark. Every unresolved tension, every unanswered message, and every sudden worry about the expectations of tomorrow can be left entirely alone on the floor of the room. They possess no solid substance in this quiet hour, nor do they have the power to disturb the deep, somatic release that is now washing through your limbs. The active mind is finally laying down its woven willow fish trap, letting the analytical planning dissolve into the clear night air like morning mist, vanishing into the heavy pine canopy. You are returning to your original nature, A nature that is already spacious, already stable, and completely insulated from the surface light. Sink down further into the dreamless, beautiful quiet, allowing the internal monitor to rest without conditions as you drift into a deep and undisturbed sleep. The silence that fills the room now is remarkably heavy and supportive, a soft blanket that cushions your framework against the remaining friction of the valley. In this state of total surrender, the artificial boundary between your safety and the environment begins to soften, leaving only the calm, unhurried movement of the breath. Your shoulders have settled completely into the mattress, your jaw is loose, and the space between your eyebrows is entirely smooth. The long journey through the estuary bays has brought you to this single point of perfect rest, where nothing needs to be monitored, nothing needs to be fixed, and nothing needs to be earned. You are allowed to simply exist as the deep stone beneath the fire, letting the quiet universe breathe through you without an ounce of resistance. As the final currents of thought drift away into the dark river outside, the mind rests in a state of luminous, undisturbed simplicity. The willow trap's still, the heavy copper weight is cool, and the wide meadow is resting quietly under the heavy evening fog. The life you were trying so hard to protect through constant alertness is perfectly safe in the custody of the night, requiring no further management from your tired thoughts. You can let go of the very last thread of control, allowing your consciousness to dissolve completely into the vast protective soil of dreamless sleep, resting fully in the deep, unburdened home that has been waiting for your return since the very beginning of the day. The breath continues its soft, automatic journey past the lips, expanding the ribs like a quiet wind through the high trees, and then settling back down into the absolute stillness of the frame. This quiet space does not demand an intellectual answer from your tired mind tonight. It is not a riddle for your thoughts to untangle, or a complex puzzle that needs to be deciphered before your eyes can finally close. It is simply a gentle hollow in the stone where the cold rains can gather and remain perfectly still. You can feel the distinct texture of the unadorned surface against your cheek, providing a cool, stable harbor for the head that has spent the entire day carrying the heavy structures of your ambitions. The tension in your temples is beginning to dissolve, spreading outward like ink dropping into clean water, losing its sharp concentration and becoming entirely transparent. We spend so much of our life energy trying to construct an unshakable facade, building high walls around our private fears and polishing the exterior glaze until it reflects only what we want the world to see. We believe that if we can just become strong enough, useful enough, or perfect enough, we will finally earn the right to exist without anxiety. But the old boat builder near the tidal estuary understood a much older truth, a truth that sits within the very marrow of your bones tonight. The strength of the solid ground does not come from the absence of currents, but from the way the earth learns to remain completely still beneath them, finding a stable presence that no single isolated timber could ever achieve on its own. You do not have to be an independent, flawless monument to be safely held by this life. Let the awareness of your physical weight sink down another fraction of an inch into the bedding, letting the bed accept the entirety of your history without judgment. You do not need to present a clean record of your past choices to the darkness. Every conversation that felt strained, every reaction you wish you could recall, and every moment where your patience gave way to fatigue can be left completely alone in the shadows. These things are not permanent stains on your character. They are simply the natural, textured grooves worn into the slate threshold by the simple act of walking through a human life. They show that you have participated fully in the world, that you have allowed yourself to feel, to stumble, and to learn from the rough friction of the path. Listen to the absolute silence that fills the space between your breaths, a silence that is not empty, but incredibly rich and welcoming in this space. There is no inspector watching your thoughts, no judge calculating your worth, and no standard you must rise to meet before the morning sun touches the windowsill. The mind can finally drop its tools, leaving the heavy copper fishing weight resting quietly in the center of the deep water. The building is done for the day. The path is exactly as long as it needs to be for tonight, and the unfinished spaces can wait in the darkness without any loss of their inherent value. The cool night air continues to circulate through the open space, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp moss and wet clay deep into your lungs. Each time you exhale, you are letting go of a tiny bit of the artificial glaze you have been maintaining for the sake of others. You are allowing yourself to become porous, to become earthen, to become a vessel that is completely open to the natural flow of the night. The internal pressure that threatened to split your spirit apart is dissolving into the vast, calm space of the bedroom, leaving only a deep, quiet sense of self-belonging. You are returning to your truest home, a home that does not require you to be anything other than exactly what you are right now. The small horizontal crack at the base of your awareness is not a fault line to be feared, but the very doorway through which your life receives its deepest nourishment. It is the place where the heavy, unexpressed tears can slowly drain into the soil, feeding a quiet internal garden that grows without your conscious effort. You do not have to force the moss to carpet the stones, and you do not have to command the wild ferns to uncurl their leaves in the dark. Nature knows exactly how to heal the fractures if we simply stop striking them with our own harsh self-reproach. The body knows how to rest, the heart knows how to soften, and the mind knows how to dissolve its own defenses when the night becomes heavy enough to demand it. Let your consciousness drift further down into the deep, dark layers of porous soil, far beneath the surface noise of your daily ambitions. You are settling into the quiet earth, completely undisturbed by the winds that blow across the high peaks. The thoughts are becoming distant, faint echoes of a bell that has already fallen silent, leaving only the vast, still sky behind. The darkness is a gentle blanket, covering every uneven edge and smoothing over every sharp angle with a profound, unconditional acceptance. You do not have to solve your whole life before your eyes close. It is entirely enough just for this hour to let the cracks breathe, to trust the dark, and to sink completely into the dreamless, beautiful rest that has been waiting for you all along. The heavy wood remains perfectly integral as the water changes its depth from morning to night, finding its core untouched by the length of the tide. The mind has dropped its frantic count of the waves, allowing the structure of your identity to dissolve into the vast, dark expanse of the open bay. You are no longer required to pull against the riverbank. You are the bank itself, wide, silent, and completely whole under the sky. If the affection you have been trying to secure by holding the river back was never yours to trap, what prevents you from resting deeply in the vast ocean that already claims your presence? The silent expansion of the delta takes up its natural placement, without checking the volume of the incoming currents, remaining entirely complete within its own mud boundaries as the evening grows absolute. When the dark water moves smoothly across the wide reed beds, the final necessity to manage the proximity of your relationships dissolves into the stillness of the room. This involuntary urge to evaluate your standing through the changing faces of the world is merely an echo left over from the heavy waking hours of the day, a protective habit that carries zero utility here in the vast landscape of the night. The internal monitor can simply notice its own deep-seated reflex to scan the horizon without choosing to cooperate with the tension, letting the lingering fears drift past like loose willow leaves carried on the estuary tide, vanishing completely into the dark water below. You are under no obligation to keep a perfect vigil over the room tonight. When we observe the structural design of our deepest inner fatigue, we find that the framework of the body is rarely exhausted by the simple presence of other human beings. The profound depletion grows from the continuous internal maintenance of a flawless shield, the endless effort required to intercept every microshift in affection before it can touch the ground of your existence. But the gray driftwood resting in the silt does not ask for a static river to remain structurally integral. It survives the seasonal storms precisely because it remains deeply embedded in the cool, dark mud, allowing the wild currents of the estuary to wash over its surface without moving the fiber by a single hair. Your life is not a fragile screen meant to break under the weight of another person's volatile nature. It is a solid foundation that discovers its truest resilience by letting the moving waves alter their geometry without your intervention. Let the slow, natural rise of your lower abdomen become the central anchor for your drifting awareness, a gentle, unhurried motion that requires zero conscious design to remain perfectly whole. You do not need to construct a new layer of protection or resolve the remaining frictions of the week to deserve this state of absolute rest. The ground of your body holds its value simply by breathing, by existing as a quiet basin where the cool night air can circulate without being measured or controlled. The darkness is a vast, uncritical sanctuary that welcomes every exposed vulnerability and every natural limit, recognizing them not as defects of your character, but as the exact openings through which stillness and genuine peace can settle directly into the frame. Every unresolved tension, every unanswered message, and every sudden worry about the expectations of tomorrow can be left entirely alone on the floorboards of the room. They possess no solid substance in this quiet hour, nor do they have the strength to disrupt the deep, somatic release that is now washing through your limbs. The active mind is finally laying down its woven willow fish trap, letting the analytical planning dissolve into the quiet atmosphere, like mist vanishing into the heavy forest canopy. You are returning to your original nature, a nature that is already vast, already stable, and completely insulated from the surface light. Sink down further into the dreamless, beautiful quiet, allowing the internal monitor to rest without conditions as you drift into a deep and undisturbed sleep. The silence that fills the space now is remarkably heavy and supportive, a soft blanket that cushions your spirit against the remaining noise of the world. In this state of total surrender, the artificial boundary between your safety and the environment begins to melt away, leaving only the calm, unhurried flow of the breath. Your shoulders have settled completely into the mattress, your jaw is loose, and the space between your eyebrows is entirely smooth. The long journey through the estuary bays has brought you to this single point of perfect rest, where nothing needs to be monitored, nothing needs to be fixed, and nothing needs to be earned. You are allowed to simply exist as the deep stone beneath the fire, letting the quiet night move through you without an ounce of resistance. As the final currents of thought drift away into the dark ravine outside, the mind rests in a state of luminous, undisturbed simplicity. The willow trap is still, the heavy copper weight is cool, and the wild meadow is resting quietly under the heavy evening fog. The life you were trying so hard to protect through constant compliance is perfectly safe in the custody of the night, requiring no further verification from your tired thoughts. You can let go of the very last thread of control, allowing your consciousness to dissolve completely into the vast, protective soil of dreamless sleep, resting fully in the deep, unburdened home that has been waiting for your return since the very beginning of the day. The shadows on the wall move with a slow, almost imperceptible cadence, tracing the contours of the quiet room and smoothing over every sharp angle with a profound, unconditional acceptance. You do not have to solve your whole life before your eyes close for the night. The soil does not look for a certificate of efficiency before it permits the clover to rest, and the sky does not demand a reason before it blankets the ridge in deep indigo. It is entirely enough, just for this hour, to leave the ledger behind, to trust the dark, and to sink completely into the dreamless, beautiful rest that has been waiting for you all along. The breath continues its soft, automatic journey past the lips, expanding the ribs like a quiet breeze through the valley, and then settling back down into the absolute stillness of the frame. This quiet space does not demand an intellectual answer from your tired mind tonight. It is not a riddle for your thoughts to untangle, or a complex puzzle that needs to be deciphered before your eyes can finally close. It is simply a gentle hollow in the stone where the cold rains can gather and remain perfectly still. You can feel the distinct texture of the unadorned surface against your cheek, providing a cool, stable harbor for the head that has spent the entire day carrying the heavy structures of your ambitions. The tension in your temples is beginning to dissolve, spreading outward like ink dropping into clean water, losing its sharp concentration and becoming entirely transparent. The cool night air continues to circulate through the open space, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp moss and wet clay deep into your lungs. Each time you exhale, you are letting go of a tiny bit of the artificial glaze you have been maintaining for the sake of others. You are allowing yourself to become porous, to become earthen, to become a vessel that is completely open to the natural flow of the night. The internal pressure that threatened to split your spirit apart is dissolving into the vast, calm space of the bedroom, leaving only a deep, quiet sense of self-belonging. You are returning to your truest home, a home that does not require you to be anything other than exactly what you are right now. Let your consciousness drift further down into the deep, dark layers of porous soil. Far beneath the surface noise of your daily ambitions, you are settling into the quiet earth, completely undisturbed by the winds that blow across the high peaks. The thoughts are becoming distant, faint echoes of a bell that has already fallen silent, leaving only the vast, still sky behind. The darkness is a gentle blanket, covering every uneven edge and smoothing over every sharp angle with a profound, unconditional acceptance. You do not have to solve your whole life before your eyes close. It is entirely enough, just for this hour, to let the cracks breathe, to trust the dark, and to sink completely into the dreamless, beautiful rest that has been waiting for you all along. The deep wood survives the dark precisely because it lets the shadows lengthen and shrink without altering its own weight, showing us that true resilience lives in what we allow to move past us. When we stop demanding that our minds fix every dark line that crosses the path, we discover an incredible sense of internal space. The workshop did not become still because the apprentice caught the moving shadow. It found its peace when he looked at the heavy weight, allowing the river to whirl while the stone beneath remained completely untouched by the current. Could it be that the space you have been trying to protect by anchoring the storms of others has always been yours to leave completely untended in the quiet night?